Hi everyone. I'm going to be talking you through the top tips for paper one now. So this is something that you can revise from before your exam just to make sure that you've remembered everything. Okay, so the first thing is on paper one, questions 1 and 2 is don't overthink the answers. They're very just short answers, not many marks. Don't explain. You're wasting time if you're explaining. You just need to put the quotes in there and keep them concise. Okay, so don't just quote the whole of the section that they're asking you to find the quotes from, but keep it down to a word or phrase depending on what they're asking for. Okay, so moving on to question 3. This is 6 marks on paper 1. The bit that I've highlighted here is the bit that is always the same, so it's always just a certain 1 or 2 paragraphs they're going to ask you to look at, and it will say in lines or whatever, how does the writer use language and structure to, and then it will be whatever the question's asking you to find. So in this case, it's narrator's thoughts and feelings, but it could be something different. And support your views with reference to the text. So it's always going to look like this. And so you need to look out for these words, language and structure, and then you know it's this language and structure question. And what you need to do here, it's only 6 marks, so you need to do 1 language paragraph, 1 structure paragraph, and then if you've got time, you need to do one more of language or structure. Okay, so with language, the best way to think of language is it's a word. So find a word, just go. And if you don't know if it's an adjective or whatever, don't worry, just say the word, and then that will count as language. Or if you can find a metaphor, simile, alliteration, or something specific like adjectives, fine, that's great as well. And then make sure in your explanation you explain what that word or phrase means in your own words, and explain the effect in relation to the question. So don't just explain the effect in general of that word, but explain how does that relate back, so for the example here, to thoughts and feelings. Okay, and the same with structure. You need to find something that's specifically structure, so it could be repetition, listing, short sentences, questions, speech, for example. These are all examples of structure. But it's really, really important to get the structure credit for the structure. You need to explain why that structure has been used. And the best way to do this, I think, is to say, what does it emphasize? So the repetition emphasizes how confused he is, for example, or the question emphasizes that he doesn't know the answer, or, whatever it happens to be. Okay. One thing to point out is something like repetition. If you're writing about what the word means, that could count as language. But if you're talking about why it's been repeated, then that counts as structure. Okay. And then if you've got more time, so perhaps at the end, go back and do a third one, and you can choose if it's language or structure. So some texts have got much more things you can write about language, and some have got more about structure. Okay. And you need to make sure you put the point in there. So which is it, language or structure, and what type is it? Your evidence, your quote, you need to explain it, like I said, relating back to the question, and that's why you've got link there, which just reminds you need to link it back to the question. You need to actually answer the question, not just say a rhetorical question makes you think. You've got to say, well, what is it specifically that you're thinking about, for example? Okay, so question 4, this is the evaluation question. Okay, so again here, it's the evaluation question because it will have the word evaluate in it. And again, the bit I've highlighted is this how pretty much I think how the question will always look. There's an attempt to, in this case, it's create an atmosphere of mystery, but it's not always going to be mystery, obviously. And then of course it says to evaluate, and again use the references. So this is again reminding you what you need to include in your answer. Okay, so the main thing here is look really carefully at what it is you're being asked to find. So in this case, an atmosphere of mystery, and find some bits in the text, preferably something from, different parts of the text, ideally beginning, middle and end, but it depends on how it's been written really, if they've spread it out or not. Find any parts of the text which you think create an atmosphere of mystery, or where you think the writer's trying to create an atmosphere of mystery anyway. And then think, well, how have they done that? Why? How is it mysterious? Is it the words that they've used? Is it the setting that they've created, etc.? So use themes, ideas, events, and settings only if they're useful. Okay, because some people try to shoehorn these in, and then it's not a very successful answer. So, for example, setting can often be really useful, especially in fiction, which this paper is. language and structure is also fine. So you could talk about the words that have been used, or maybe there's some repetition being used or something. And the really important thing here is don't forget to use these evaluative terms. So things like these sort of terms show that you are evaluating. And if you can as well, single word analysis can also make your answer that little bit more evaluative and successful. So you need to put in point what it is that they're trying to do. So it's kind of repeating the question basically, putting your evidence in there and then explaining, maybe with some single word analysis, and then make sure you always link it back to the question. So how successful has it been, and how mysterious, for example, is it? So I'll give you an example here of a paragraph, because I think sometimes it's easier just to have a look at an example. Okay, so the writer effectively creates a sense of mystery by describing a setting as dead of night and a suspiciously lonely place. So that's your point, isn't it? And then you've got some evidence, a couple of bits of evidence into the setting there. And then you've got, by setting this part of the story at night, it makes the reader, I've changed that. By setting this part of the story at night, it makes the reader anticipate that something mysterious or scary might happen, as this is a setting which we associate with mystery genre and scary stories. Okay, so that's an explanation, isn't it? By using the phrase dead of night, he makes us think of death, and by saying suspiciously, we think that something unusual and mysterious might be happening. So we've got some single word analysis there. This helps the writer successfully build a feeling of mystery. So we've got the link. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that you need to be writing. All right, so we'll now quickly look at the writing section. So this is 40 marks, which is 25% of your marks overall. So make sure you leave plenty of time, at least 45 minutes to answer this. Okay, so here's an example. So you've got question 5 or 6. You only have to answer one of them. I've just used an example here of question 6, so they look pretty much the same. So two things to remember here. It will often say something like something that happened to you or someone you know. It doesn't have to be really you or someone you know. It just means that you can write it in the first person, you can write it in the third person, you can make it up. It can be real or imagined, okay? So don't feel it has to be a real thing that's happened to somebody that you actually know. I think this bit at the bottom in italics is really useful for helping you plan. So when it says use of vocabulary, you could plan here some of the good words that you know that you want to make sure you include. So for example, I don't know, gruesome. Maybe you really like that word and you want to put that in. So you could just make sure that you're going to use that word. For example, just add it in there. Or I don't know, apocalypse, or I don't know, any of the words that you really like and you want to show off your knowledge of, you can put them in. Spelling, that reminds you, make sure you check your work through for spelling. Punctuation and grammar, so this is really useful. I think what I always do is do a little list of all the punctuation I want to include, and then almost you can tick it off as you use it in your writing. And then grammar, I use this to remember things like short sentence, long sentence, question, to make sure you've got all of those in, to show that you've used a range of different sentences. Okay, so that's a good way of just making sure that you remember to include everything that's in the mark scheme, really. Also, a few top tips for this question. You're doing creative writing, so a really good way to make sure that you're creative, that you've been as creative as possible, to try use your 5 senses, okay, or as many senses as you can. This will help to make your writing more interesting. Using the show don't tell technique as well is really, really helpful. So instead of saying he was nervous, say like his stomach was flipping and his hands were sweating and he felt sick or something. So try and let the reader work out what's happening. Don't just spell it out for them. Narrative perspective is a really good way as well of thinking. Think about who or what are you writing from the point of view of, and writing from an unusual or different narrative perspective can be really, really effective. Okay, so for example, think about who you are. You don't have to be yourself. You could be some other kind of character, or you could write from the point of view of like a gun or a knife or a tree or a cat or something. Okay, and that can often make your writing a lot more interesting. Um, Remember to do really, really detailed description. Okay, so use your adjectives, use metaphors, use similes, think about things from all five senses. And a really top tip as well is more description, less action. Okay, maybe just focus on one moment of a scene or one moment of a story or a narrative. Don't go, oh, and then that happened, and then he chased after him, and then he shot him, and really you can't write about that much action in a really short amount of time. So it's better to just write about one moment and maybe just hint at what might have happened before or after. Okay, so good luck. You're going to do brilliantly, and fingers crossed.